Imagine a world where more women had the time to fully explore their genius. Welcome to She Rebel Radio, the UK's podcast for women leaders and founders ready to unlearn conventional rules and lead their businesses of significance. We've been hailed for counter-status quo ideas and a whole dose of feminine perspective. This is our 8th series. My name's Lulu Minns and I host retreats and create spaces for women leaders to explore their genius. And today, I'm going to create that same space right here for you on this podcast. Welcome to episode 125 of She Rebel Radio, Writing for History with Siobhan Curham. Siobhan is an award-winning author of almost 50 books for adults, young adults and children, fiction and non-fiction, and her work has been featured in The Guardian, BBC, Daily Express, Spirit and Destiny and Cosmopolitan magazine. Having overcome her own barriers to writing, Siobhan also coaches and supports business owners, celebrities, musicians and others to write. It's safe to say her passion for writing is infectious and her books, heartbreaking, uplifting, entertaining and created to inspire. Most recently, she's been in Paris and immersing herself in writing historical fiction, which is one of my favourite genres, especially when there's a female lead. Beyond the Broken Sky, An American in Paris, The Secret Keeper, The Storyteller of Auschwitz, and The Secret Photograph are all set in World War II. We met at a Christmas party pre-COVID and just couldn't stop chatting. So Siobhan, how the devil are you?
I'm great, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me on. I can't believe how long ago was that party we met. I guess it must have been 2019 or 2020. So a lot has happened.
Yeah, definitely. I think it was 2019. I'd love to start in terms of, historical fiction.
Yeah.
It's absolutely one of my favourite genres because I feel like you learn about the past and also become immersed in story. I absolutely loved your book, The Storyteller of Auschwitz, and we'll be reading the rest of your World War II novels. But I'd love to ask, what's your favourite historical fiction book?
My favourite is a novel called The Alice Network by an author called Kate Quinn. It's set during, it's a dual timeline. So the main story is set during World War I, and it's about a female spy during the First World War. And then the second storyline is set in 1947, just after the Second World War. And it just tells the story of these two women and how they kind of link. And I just loved it. I think because for me, I love books with strong characters. So to this day, I mean, I read that a good few years ago, but I still remember the characters vividly. And so, yeah, I think that to me is what makes a really good story. If you really wish you knew the characters in real life, and they leap off the page because they're so well drawn.
Yeah. And we've spoken to one of our previous guests about, missing them when the book finishes.
Yes.
As well.
Yeah, like when you start reading, I don't know if anyone else does this, but if I'm loving a book like that and the characters, I will start reading slowly when I'm getting towards the end. I'm kind of like, okay, ration yourself.
Yeah.
So I'll a few pages a day because I just don't want it to end.
I think I need to take your advice on that because I speed up because I'm desperate to know what happens, and then I kind of go into grief because it's finished.
Yeah. I know it's hard because that's the thing. If it's a really good plot, you want to keep reading, don't you? So, but yeah, I think that's definitely a sign of a good book, isn't it? When you can talk about it like that.
Yeah, and I think something around World War I, World War II, and those novels are because of the impact on us as a collective and a mass of people. And I also love books that also link, the past and the present or two different periods of time and how that impacts the next person or the next situation. So yeah, I'd love to know what sparked the transition for you into writing historical fiction, because you've written lots of things in for different age groups and things like that. What was your initial inspiration?
Well, to be honest, I've always loved history, and particularly World War II, because my grandparents, who I was very close to, my granddad was in the Navy during the Second World War, and my grandma lived in London during the Blitz. And I remember as a kid, I would be transfixed by her stories of what it was like, living in London during the Blitz. And one thing that really struck me was how they managed to get on with life as normal, because to me, especially as a kid, well, as an adult too, the notion of bombs raining down on you every night, every day, and yet people were still going to work, they were still trying to get on with their lives. You know, that whole thing about the Blitz spirit, you know, where you just kind of get on with it kind of thing, which I was, you know, I was kind of in awe of. And then it was weird timing for me because I actually, well, you know, I'll keep this really brief, but basically I'd written another novel for adults. I'd spent the beginning of my career, I wrote for novels for adults. Then I spent about 10 years writing fiction and non-fiction for young adults, and I really wanted to get back into writing for adults. And so I'd written this novel that was set in the 60s, and my agent submitted it to all the major publishers, and they all kind of came back with the same thing. They really liked my writing, but they couldn't see how they were going to market this book. It didn't fit neatly into a, you know, a category or a genre or whatever. And then one of the publishers that saw it said, had I ever considered writing World War II fiction? Because she thought that that would be something that I could, you know, I'd be strong at or whatever. And if I'm totally honest with you, it hadn't occurred to me. But the minute she said it, I thought, oh, wow, that would be amazing, because, you know, I have this real interest anyway in World War II and history. And you know, so I kind of jumped I bit her hand off, you know, because I thought you don't get an opportunity like this very often where a publisher actually asks you to write something.
No.
So exactly, so yeah, so it was a funny and I like sharing the story because I'd been feeling really down because obviously this other book I'd written was getting rejected by everyone, and so I could have given up. And I remember at one point my agent saying, shall we submit to this publisher book couture? And I, you know, at that point I could have said, oh no. And I think a lot of people do, you know, when they're trying to do whatever you're trying to do, you know, that it's so easy, isn't it? And I don't blame anyone for giving up if you've had, you know, sort of a few setbacks. But anyhow, I said, yeah, let's give it a go. And because of that, you know, I'm now writing my 7th book for book couture at the moment, here in Paris. And yeah, you know, so and the 6th one is about to come out tomorrow.
Now, you've written nearly 50 books, which is incredible. You said none has felt as important as the Storyteller of Auschwitz. Why was this part of history so important for you and for us in the present world at the moment?
I think because there are frightening parallels. I remember as a kid, my mum sat me down and she showed me a book about the Holocaust, and there were photos in the book of Auschwitz. And I will never forget, as a child, you know, I think I must have been about, I don't know, 8 or 10, something around that time, probably about 10. And you know, they were graphic photographs, you know, which we've probably all seen at some point, but, you know, of the mass grave, for example, and, you know, people starving to death. And I remember my mum saying to me, we must never forget, like explaining what happened and saying we must never, ever forget that this happened in order to stop it from happening again. And then as I grew up, I remember throughout my teen years, you know, I just used to think, how did Hitler managed to do what he did? I couldn't understand it, you know, like how he managed to murder so many people. And I know the world fought back, obviously, but it was, how did he get to that position of power where he was able to wreak so much damage? And I couldn't understand it. And so in my mind, I was thinking, well, it was obviously some kind of weird blip or whatever in history. But sadly, and especially now, as I've been researching World War II in depth and looking into the run-up, you know, like it didn't happen overnight. You know, the Holocaust didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, steady drip, drip of anti-Semitism, of fascism, and of leaders telling people, you know, sort of encouraging people to put all of the blame onto another group of people. And you know, and then, you know, I've seen really frightening parallels now happening, you know, in modern times, and sort of thinking, oh, okay, this is how it happens. This is how it begins.
Yeah.
Unless we do something at this point to really stop it and try and nip it in the bud, you know, and so I think that's why I feel so passionately about it, because I can see it happening, you know, I can see it happening again. And I think also on a personal note, I have a son who's 26 and he is living and working in Ukraine. And so, you know, we have another war on our doorstep. And again, it's kind of like the scary parallels. And so, yeah, so it's a mixture of all those things really that sort of And that's why I think The Storyteller of Auschwitz is the most important book I've written. And it was the one I mean, I take all my books seriously, but this subject, obviously, it's such a serious subject matter. It's so important to get it right. And yeah, so I felt a
Really,
great kind of,
really powerfully shared there, Siobhan, and I totally agree with you with frightening parallels. And again, you know, the war in Ukraine and Russia, that hasn't come out of nowhere. There's been
yeah,
a huge build up to that, and this, you know, men in positions of power, and you know, the creation of other, and this
yeah,
separation and
yeah,
blame that
yeah,
we've actually talked about on a previous episode of She Rebel Radio, that, you know, separation can be a way to control people,
yeah,
and we've got to be really wary of that and division politics. And I think what's really interesting as well that you say about that, when you're young and you think it's a blip, you're like, oh, that wouldn't happen again, and you
yeah,
mature and you understand again the
yes,
connection of all these things, and
yeah,
how these things become created. And you know, for us as women, we've always kind of been a bit of on the periphery of that, not being in positions of power. and
yeah,
and you know,
yeah.
that's why I love that your book has a strong female lead as well, because we just need more of that too. Your book, whilst fiction, you know, begins with a little potential romance, which I always love. It's rooted in fact, as we've been talking about. Now, who was your inspiration for the main character that is the heartwarming and brave Jewish author Well?
Well, mainly there was an author called Etty Hillesum who was a Dutch woman, young woman in her 20s, living in Amsterdam when the war started. And she's sometimes referred to as the adult Anne Frank because she kept a diary too. And she also ended up being killed in Auschwitz. And so I read her diary, and it's wonderful, you know, because at the start she's kind of, the occupation has begun, but she's still living in Amsterdam, and it's like the diary of any 20-something-year-old woman, you know. She's involved with this guy, and she's kind of, you know, and there's a sort of, I don't want to say immaturity to it, not immaturity, that's the wrong word, but you know, she goes on such a journey, you know, and
Yeah,
obviously,
I call it, Siobhan, maiden type energy. There's
right,
a
yes,
vulnerability and
yes,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
exactly,
As we were
exactly
saying,
that.
which ties in with, it's at that stage you're unaware how things like that can happen in the world.
Yes,
Well,
exactly, exactly. But then there's such a growth in her, you know, and then when the occupation begins, she has the opportunity, like friends are, you know, she has the opportunity to go to a place of safety. You know, a couple of times friends offer to get her out of there, but she feels very strongly that, you know, she doesn't want to, she feels that would be a betrayal, and she's Jewish, you know, and she feels it would be betrayal to her people to escape when so many others can't. But she also, as a writer, she felt really strongly that she could actually do some good, you know, like as a writer. That I have a quote from her, if you like, I could share it, which really sums it up and is really the inspiration for the Storyteller of Auschwitz.
yes, please. We'd love to hear it.
Yeah, so a camp, so by that she means obviously a concentration camp. A camp needs a poet, one who experiences life there, even there, as a bard, and is able to sing about it. Let me be the thinking heart of these barracks. And I was so, God, as I read that, I get choked up, you know, because I think, like, to be able to, in the face of, you know, what went on, the horrors that were going on there, to be able to have that presence of mind. And she goes on a real spiritual journey as well, you know, and so she kind of sees it almost as her duty, a spiritual duty, to try and help people, you know, sort of find meaning, I guess, in the camp, which sort of brings me on to another writer that I know you're a fan of. There was another inspiration, Viktor Frankl.
Yes.
So he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who ended up in Auschwitz. Thankfully, he survived. But because he was a psychiatrist, he was very interested in you know, observing his fellow prisoners and seeing, he kind of noticed that he was interested in, well, why do some survive and others don't? Because they're all in the equally awful situation. They're all being starved. They're all in, you know, terrible position physically. But
Yeah.
he noticed that those prisoners who were able to connect with some kind of positive purpose in life and some kind of meaning to their life were, were more likely to survive. And the people that would lose themselves in imagining that purpose, daydreaming about whether it's a loved one or whatever, but a reason to keep living. So that's why, he had, his book is called Man's Search for Meaning, because he believed that, if you can find a meaning to your life, you can get through almost any sort of hardship, even at Auschwitz.
Yeah, and I read that book in lockdown. I'd always heard of it and his quotes, and just felt quite called to read it in lockdown. And because there's some parallels going on in the world of this collective experience and
Yeah.
suffering to some degree, and found it really powerful. And I love the quote that you shared there of being the thinking heart.
Yeah.
Which again, just imagining a world of more people in power being the thinking heart would be,
Yes. Oh gosh. Yeah, it'd be amazing.
yeah, it would. And the heart itself being an area of neural intelligence and that we can tap into, and
Yeah.
spiritual duty, as you said there, what's our
Yeah.
spiritual duty in times that we can find meaning in suffering. Did you
Mm,
have any
mm,
other, and thank you for sharing with us a female role model, because so often
mm.
that is missing from
Yeah.
history and narrative for us as women.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's the thing, and there were so many really strong women. Always, obviously, but they never, they always kind of get airbrushed out of history, don't they? Or they tend to be. So, and I think with what's interesting about World War II is that because women, I mean, this is kind of going off the Auschwitz topic, but other books I've written have been about resistance, women in the resistance, and because women, especially at first, the Germans didn't suspect women of being resistance operatives or spies, so it was kind of easier for them to career things around in secret and to work as spies. But when you imagine doing that as a woman, putting yourself in these positions where your life is really in danger, on a daily basis, it's quite incredible, isn't it? How brave they
Yeah, it really is. And I know about the photographer Lee Miller as well. And as we were talking about photographs, she took very similar photographs of the concentration camp
Yeah,
Dachau. When the Allies had victory, as it were.
yeah.
But and was she some degree of inspiration for your book, The Secret Photograph, that is being released very soon? And what other secrets can you tell us about that book?
Yeah, so she was initially, I was fascinated by I read something about her, that there were only a very few female photojournalists in World War II. So she was a fashion photographer initially. And then after the war, so once Paris had been liberated, she'd spent the war in London, and then she came straight to Paris when it was liberated. And that's when she started taking photos of the war and traveling with the Allied soldiers into camps. And when I was reading about her, there was something that intrigued me, which was they were saying she was able to get in really close and take very graphic photographs, of atrocities and things, and the effect that had on her mentally, So that kind of sparked something in me. It was like, yeah, of course, if you're a photographer, a war photographer, you're expected to take some really quite graphic and sometimes horrendous pictures and get in very, very close to be able to do that. But what does that do to you, And so in the end, that was my starting point for The Secret Photograph. But I wanted to write about a resistance member in Paris during the war. So that's where it's completely different to Lee Miller. So my main character is based in Paris during the German occupation. And so there's another inspiration. I discovered a French woman called Julia Pirot, I think you pronounce it. And she was a photographer in Marseille, and she worked for the resistance. And so it was just that thing of and also another thing it explores is it right to take photographs of people, in really awful situations. For example, at Auschwitz, all of those photos. Now, I personally feel like we needed those photos as absolute concrete evidence that it happened, because you get all these Holocaust deniers and people like that who, so, and I feel like sometimes a photograph is needed to shock people into taking action.
Yeah.
But I don't know what you feel about that, but it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because it's kind of, then what about the people you're taking the pictures of? What about their rights and their privacy? And
I think that's quite a present conversation, isn't it, in terms of the level that we can share photographs and things like that now, and our human capacity to be able to spiritually and emotionally hold that. The same with filming and the things. I remember the war in Syria and the kind of news pictures, and I generally don't watch the news because of my spiritual, emotional well-being, and from years of working in the criminal defense field, I've seen a lot anyway. But I thought with children, seeing that kind of thing, and I think there's a statistic that we've seen X amount of violence by a certain age because of things being magnified around the world now. So we really do need to, and we're a different level of consciousness now as well, hopefully. We're definitely trying to get there. And so I think it's a really interesting conversation. And I don't think I've said to you actually before that we've had Lee Miller's granddaughter on She Rebel Radio talking about Lee. And because when I left the legal profession, I was working at Farley Farmhouse where she lived, and the film is coming out soon of Kate Winslet playing Lee in that particular period of her in the war, and the effect that had on her. So that's going to be great for us to see as well.
No, I'm really looking forward to that, definitely. I mean, I think she's such an inspiration, but it did take its toll on her, definitely, what she saw.
And I and two of my favorite She Rebels, I've been a big Lee fan since I was about 15, 16, so and love Kate Winslet as well, so I think that's going to be really powerful. And we can hear the level of depth that you have to do in terms of researching these books. How much research do you need to undertake, do you feel, to accurately portray something as impactful in our history as things like the Holocaust?
I think a lot, in order to, especially because you're, as a historical novelist, you're obviously writing about something you haven't experienced at first hand, because how could you, so I feel a huge responsibility to do, a lot of research. And what I like to do, because I think everyone's familiar with, like I call the historical headlines, like the big stories or whatever. But like I said earlier, I love to I will go down rabbit holes, and find out of print books and things, that are written by people who were actually there at the time. And I will go through them forensically for little details, like, for example, in The Secret Photograph, there's a little detail that I found and I'd never seen before. But in Paris, I don't know if anyone who's been to Paris listening to this will know, on the metro you get these little card tickets, like one ticket per journey or whatever. And back in the war days, those tickets were used as a form of protest, which I had never heard of before, but I came across recently. And so basically, so the way it works in Paris is you only need the ticket when you enter the metro system, but you don't need it again at the end, to get back out. So what they used to do during the war is they would fold their little cardboard tickets into a V shape, because V for victory was the symbol of the French resistance. And then they would drop their V-shaped tickets on the floor of the train or on the station platform or whatever. But it was just a kind of like way of relatively safe way of them protesting. But obviously then for the Germans or the French police who were on the side of the Germans, if they walked down into a station, they would see a sea of V shapes, in cardboard tickets. I just thought that really appealed to me anyhow.
I love that. A secret resistance, really. We are here. You might not know who we are, but we're here, and we're not accepting this.
And there are loads of us, like look at how many of these tickets are. So things like that. So I do take it very seriously, because I feel like because I wasn't there, so I feel like I have to, almost like I'll spend months reading and reading and reading, or watching documentaries or whatever, and it's almost like inhaling it all, into my brain.
Yeah.
And so that then I can, sort of put it all into the story, and hopefully get it as realistic as it is possible for someone who wasn't actually there.
Yeah. And do you have to take care of yourself when you're, immersing yourself in some of the horrors of that?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. And I'm really loath to even say anything negative about it, because at the end of the day, I'm not experiencing it firsthand. So I would never moan about it. But yeah, I mean, at the moment, for example, the book I'm working on, I'm coming to a really harrowing part. It's set in Poland during the war. And I had to have a break this weekend from it, because it can get quite, sort of, I don't know. But I think the thing is, what I like to do with my books is and that's why Viktor Frankl and Etty Hillesum are such inspirations to me, and Anne Frank, that's another one, that they actually experienced these horrors, and yet they were able to find sort of glimmers of light and love and inspiration. And so that's what I another really important thing with my books, is that I always imbue them with hope, and with that, while keeping them realistic, because I think
Yeah.
that's so important, isn't it? It's so important to remind people that yes, there is hate in the world, but any time you have any atrocity, there are always countless examples, aren't there, of people being so loving to each other. Like 9/11 was a good example, an awful thing that happened, and yet there are so many countless stories of love and bravery that came out of that disaster. So
Yeah, I love that in terms of glimmers of light. And I often say, when we find that glimmer of light, or even we make choices out of a space of love instead of fear or hate, or we
yeah,
contribute to the collective consciousness of that instead of the latter,
yeah,
and we can all
yeah.
take that responsibility.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a great quote from Viktor Frankl on this very subject. And it was the conclusion he came to after everything he'd been through in Auschwitz. It goes like this: a thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through and in love. And I just thought, again, I get choked up reading that. This is a guy, who's in Auschwitz, who was tortured, and went through the worst experience any human being can go through. And yet that's the conclusion he came to, that
Yeah.
love is the truth. And I think I really subscribe to that belief, and I think that's the only way we're going to ever get through these horrors and out the other side, is through finding love. And that's so in every single one of my books, that is a theme. The main character, at the end of the day, that's the conclusion that they come to, or the sort of message in some way.
Yeah, and society, I think, really conditions us that love is something that we find for a romantic partner or not.
Yeah.
But it's so much more than that.
Oh yeah,
It's so much more than that, and until we ascribe to that, which has its challenges,
Yeah.
but as we say, as Viktor Frankl can come to that conclusion in such horrific circumstances,
Yeah.
then there is that hope there. Now, I love as well that you interweave lots of storytelling tips throughout the book. What are
Yes.
some of those tips, and what barriers did you need to overcome in order to write?
I think one of the first tips that feature in the novel is that every story should transform the recipient and the teller, and that's actually from a Hasidic Jewish fable that features in the book. And I loved that, because I thought, yeah, that's it kind of ties into a quote about writing by an American writer called Robert Frost that I love, which is: no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader, no laughter in the writer, no laughter in the reader, and so on. So in other words, that if the story doesn't transform the person telling it, it's not going to transform the person on the receiving end. So I think that's a really good storytelling tip for anyone out there who likes writing or telling stories. Make sure that you're really feeling it, too. Another one which features strongly. So with my character Etty in the Storyteller of Auschwitz, once she gets to Auschwitz, she sees that her role there really is to help her fellow prisoners to find meaning in their lives, and she does that by getting them to see themselves as the type of hero they'd want to read about, and I think this is a really good life lesson for all of us, but at times, if you're ever going through a difficult time or ever, just stop and think, okay, if my life were a book or a film, you could say, or a movie, and people are watching me right now and I'm the hero of this movie, are they actually going to be inspired by the way I'm acting or thinking or what I'm doing, and if not, then maybe it's time to kind of change. And I like doing that personally, when I'm having days where I'm acting like an idiot.
Which we all do. We all do.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, okay, if you were a character in a book right now, what would your reader be throwing the book across the room in disgust, like, oh my God, get a grip, woman. So yeah, I think that's a good little tip for all of us. Another thing that Etty does is she gets, through her storytelling, she gets her fellow prisoners to focus on their strengths, to remember their strengths. And she rehumanizes, because the Nazis were obviously all about dehumanizing people in Auschwitz, the Jewish people, and seeing, tattooing numbers on their arms, it's like taking away their identity. So Etty, through her storytelling, really, gets people to see their strengths, to remember who they are. She rehumanizes them. And I think the final storytelling tip really from the book is retelling stories that you tell yourself. So there's one scene in the book where they're in the hut at night and they're talking, and she's helping them retell stories from their own lives that actually happened, but in such a way that they're able to find love and forgiveness, and closure. So I think that's another thing that we can all apply to our own lives. It's like, is there a story you've been telling yourself about, say, for example, another person in your life? Oh, they're so this, that, and the other, like a negative story, or a story where you're casting yourself as a victim. Could you retell that story, in a way, and again, to find love and forgiveness, for yourself or for another person?
Yeah, how beautiful. I can really tell with all of those tips how it is that your stories are so impactful. And as you said, they are a transformation process of the writer and the recipient. And if you're in tears, then the reader is. And I definitely cried at the end of your book. And there, I'm a massive reader, and there is a handful of books that has had that impact on me. So thank you so much. You do create real magic in your books and stories.
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to hear. Thank you.
So you have some really beautiful short stories in the books as well. Is there a really short one you can share with us before we go?
Yeah, I'd love to. So so this comes from the beginning of the novel. So Etty has lost her book deal. So she was a best-selling author in Paris before the German occupation. Then they bring in the rules saying that Jewish authors can't be published anymore. So she's lost her book deal. And she's wandering around Paris one day feeling very sad, and she happens upon a Jewish bookstore, and she goes in and she meets the character Solomon, who becomes the main character in the book, and he shares a story with her. So it's very, very short, but it was my favorite. It's a Hasidic story which I've kind of woven in. So Solly says to her, do you have time for another very short story? I always have time for a story, I replied. Excellent. His eyes lit up. Once upon a time, at the very beginning of time, when the creator was busy creating the world, he momentarily lost control of the process. God lost control? I asked, finding the concept of an accident-prone God strangely comforting. Yes, and sparks of his being spilled down into the physical world, where they became trapped, and so his power was diminished somewhat, leaving the world vulnerable to chaos and evil. Like the Nazis, I asked, and Solomon nodded. One question that had plagued me since the Germans began their persecution of the Jewish people was how God could allow such cruelty. A weakened God certainly made sense. So there's no hope for us, I added, only half joking. Oh, but there is, he replied triumphantly. We can right the wrong and heal the world. How? Through tikkun olam. Every time we perform an act of religious contemplation like prayer or through doing a good deed for another, one of the sparks of light is released and able to return to God, and the goodness in the world is strengthened. He nodded to the book of Hasidic tales and smiled at me. And that way, spark by spark, the world will be repaired and harmony restored. I pictured sparks showering down like shooting stars, embedding themselves in the world, waiting to be released. And as Solomon passed me the books, I imagined a spark of light flying free from the pages and spiraling upwards. I love that story, I murmured. Me too, he replied. It helps me stay sane and safe in the face of all the madness. I nodded. What he was saying made perfect sense. And so that's the story that my dad actually shared with me many years ago. And I just loved the notion of, visualizing this spark of light being released. Every time you do something kind for another person or loving, a spark of light is released in the world, and the goodness in the world is strengthened. So that's probably my favorite that I feature in the book.
Thank you so much. And Solly, like, what an incredible character as well. So I was hoping you were going to share one of his stories, and it's beautiful. Cool. Yeah. It's beautiful that your dad shared that with you as well. So there's real depth in that.
Yes, well, Solly is kind of loosely based on my dad, because it's been one of the main sources of wisdom in my life. So so that's lovely to hear. Thank you.
And that heart thinking as well. So you've left us with many glimmers of light, and I know the listeners are going to really love this episode. What is next for you, and where can our listeners find you?
Okay, so they can find me at my unpronounceable, unspellable name. The only good thing about my name is that there's no one else called it. So
yeah, I was going to say, did I pronounce it incorrectly? Probably.
No, it's fine. So it's Siobhan Curham. So I'm on Siobhan Curham author on Instagram, because my original Instagram got hacked recently, so I had to start all over again. So it'd be lovely to connect with people at Siobhan Curham author on Instagram, also Siobhan Curham author on Facebook, Siobhan Curham on Twitter. And next for me, so I'm just basically traveling around now. So I'm about to leave Paris this week and go into the heart of the French countryside for 3 weeks, and then I'm off to America for a while. So it's writing as I go, really. And The Secret Photograph is out. Well, it came out on the 3rd of October. And just writing more historical novels. So it's all good.
Amazing. I can't wait to dive in. I'm definitely going to be purchasing The Secret Photograph. I think it's $1.99 on Kindle at the moment, isn't it?
It is. Yes, it is. So I mean, that's I love it when books are that cheap, because you kind of feel, well, even if I don't like it, it's not that much money spent, is it? So
yeah, but our listeners will love it. and I recommend The Storyteller of Auschwitz, like, really, really highly. Siobhan, it's been amazing to have you on She Rebel Radio. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to She Rebel Radio. If this episode has inspired you, please pass it on and share with at least one other incredible woman. Don't forget to also hit subscribe and leave us a review. You can find out more about me and my work at lulumins.com or on most social media platforms.